Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this term's Nature Seminar series. In a moment, I'll introduce our guest speaker for today, but I'll just mention that we've got quite an amazing lineup of speakers over this term. And I'll mention a few of them in the next few weeks. So next week, we've got Professor Ben Wheeler from the University of Exeter talking about nature, health and well-being, evidence and action. The week after, we have Dan Nepstad talking about the Amazon forest climate solution. The week after, we have Melissa Leach, who's now head of the Cambridge Commons Conservation Initiative and formerly Institute of Development Studies, talking about reflections on conservation justice from West Africa's Upper Guinean forests and beyond. And the week after, we have Andy Gonzalez, who's director of the Global Biodiversity Observation Network, talking about biodiversity science for 2030. And there's several more for the rest of the term as well. But it's a really nice little lineup of speakers. If you're not on our mailing list, just go to Biodiversity Oxford, the website, and you can sign up for the mailing list and also register for future events. So, and today's talk will be followed by a book signing, because we have a celebrity author with us today. Around the corner, so do link up for that and have a drink there. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Tim Coulson, who's a professor of zoology in the Department of Biology and former head of biology here in Oxford. He is a science junkie who chooses biology as it is the hardest of all sciences. It's a provocation to the physicists there for sure. And it's also a popularizer of science, as you'll see from this book. And I just asked him about his career. So he's moved around a little bit. Undergraduate in York, PhD in Imperial, then at the Institute of Zoology for a while, and Cambridge, Imperial again, and back here. But also interesting periods in the savannas of Africa, where I've come across Tim, among other places as well. Welcome, Tim, and thanks for starting the series with as big a picture as you can have on nature.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Advinda, and thanks everyone for coming. So I should probably start by explaining how a biologist became interested in how we exist and the science of how we got here. So when I was in I think I was 2021, I went off to Africa and I had two types of tablet with me. I had anti-malarials and I had water purification tablets. And I'm such an idiot, I muddled them up. So every time I thought I was taking my anti-malarials, I was swallowing pure chlorine and wondered why I had a stomach ache. And then every time I was trying to clean water I'd found from some dodgy stream when we were hiking or whatever, I was putting in my malaria prophylactics. And of course, that didn't protect me. So I got bitten by a mosquito carrying malaria, cerebral malaria. I got sick. I flew back. I was towards the end of my trip when this happened. Hadn't been feeling well for a while. I made the foolish error of thinking I'll try and drink my way through this on the flight back. Anyway, I got back. I got rushed into hospital when I had a pretty serious attack. They identified what it was. They treated it. Obviously, I'm here, but they said the next attack would probably have killed me. And up until that point, I'd been drifting around. I'd decided that like religion wasn't for me. I didn't believe in a creator. So I thought I better try and have some aim in my life. And this is the only aim I've ever had. Everything else has just been a series of accidents. I thought by the time I lie on my eventual deathbed, which I hope is some time away, I'd like to have had as good a stab at understanding what science could tell us about why we exist as I could do. So that was my aim. And I started reading really widely. As Advinda said, I did actually biology at university, but originally I was supposed to do maths at university. I had a place to read maths, but I changed at the last minute to biology. But I've always been reasonably mathematically literate, and that helped. So I started reading really broadly, forming pictures, taking notes, and then in my 30s, I started telling a few friends that I was trying to do all of this and understand everything. They said, "Oh, that sounds like a great book. You should write a book." So then I started telling everyone I was writing a book, and it became a joke because I hadn't done anything. And then during the pandemic, I had a sabbatical in Brisbane, and I thought, if I don't write this bloody book now, I'm never going to write it. So I wrote it, didn't know what to do with it, but I got very lucky, got an amazing literary agent, and she got a publisher for me. And it's called The Universal History of Us. It's got a different title in the US because we sold it to a different publisher over there. a 13.8 billion year tail from the Big Bang to you. And what I try and do in this book, and I'm going to skim over bits of it in this talk, I try to take you on a journey from how we got from the Big Bang to you and me as intelligent, highly complicated organisms as we are now. I also towards the end talk about each of our personalities. How is it some of us are shy, some of us are more outgoing, some of us are psychopaths, others are not. What is it that makes our personality? But because I don't know the personality of the reader, I weave some of my own personal story throughout the book so that I can draw back on those in the final chapters when we talk about what science can tell us about why each of us is the way we are. I probably won't get into too much of that in this talk. But the other story or the other theme that runs through it is, were we inevitable at the universe's birth, or have we won the cosmic lottery? And there are some physicists out there, and they do it for good reason, but they make the argument that actually, if we were to start the universe from exactly the same conditions as our universe started at the Big Bang, and we ran it again, we would be here now having this conversation. Whilst other people think that we've won the cosmic lottery and it's down to a huge amount of good fortune and luck. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of where those two bits of theory come from, but I do describe a bit of the background of those theories in the book in accessible language. And I'll come back to that at the end. So the book came out in June. The paperback will be out this May. And if you like the sound of my voice, I read the audiobook as well. So there we go. So here's the question that we're really trying to solve. So if we take any of us and you take yourself apart, don't do this at home, so it'd take a very long time and be extraordinarily painful. But if you took yourself apart bit by bit, you'd end up with at least 30 trillion, possibly as many as 37 trillion cells. And you'd put them into about 220 different types. So you'd have red blood cells, you'd have neurons in your brain, you'd have muscle cells, you'd have cells in your retina, and you'd be able to put them into about 220 types. People classify things in different ways, so give or take. And then if you take each one of those cells and you start to break them apart, you'll end up with tens of thousands of different types of molecule. Some of those molecules are going to be really large, consisting of millions of atoms. So, for example, DNA. Others are going to be much, much simpler. Most of you is water. So, 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. And if you do that, we know there are tens of thousands of different types. And someone has actually tried to estimate how many molecules in the human body. And we end up with 1.2 times 10 to the 27 is the best estimate that's out there. That's probably give or take many more orders of magnitude. And now if we've got 10,000, thousands of piles of these molecules, some of which are common, some of which are rare in our body, and we break those apart, we end up with atoms of 60 different elements. So we've got obviously lots of hydrogen, we've got lots of oxygen, we've got some nitrogen, plenty of carbon, bits of iron. But some cobalt, for example, is relatively rare. But we're made of 60 different elements. So we've gone from you down to 60 different elements. But what if we break the elements apart? We end up with atomic nuclei, and we end up with which are the bits in the middle of the elements, the atoms, atomic nuclei consisting of protons and neutrons and electrons. And if we break the protons and neutrons apart, we end up with 2 types of quarks or quarks, depending on how you want to pronounce them, up quarks and down quarks. And when the universe formed, it formed as a pinprick of energy, as I'm going to talk about in a minute. Shortly after the formation, lots and lots of quarks and electrons were produced. They came into existence. And the question is how have they been able to go from lots of quarks, for some of those quarks and some of those electrons, ending up as one of the most complicated objects in the known universe? And it's quite a story. So, and that's what and that's what I tell in the book, all of the things that had to happen and what science can tell us about what to happen for you and me to self-assemble, and why did it take so long? And it took a staggeringly long amount of time. The universe has been aged at 13.77 billion years ago. It's been aged, I won't go through the details of exactly how it's been aged, but two of the ways where information from this has been arrived at is if you look out at the night sky, the further away things are, the longer it has taken light to get here. So you're looking back in time as you gaze into the night sky. And one of the things that you find is galaxies, further away you look, are moving away from us. And the further away they are, the faster they're moving. And if you play the clock backwards and you say, what happens if we take all of those galaxies, of which there are billions in the observable universe, and you run the clock backwards, you come to the conclusion that they must have been at a single point at the beginning of the universe, and you can estimate what that point is, about 13.77 billion years ago. Well, that's one part of the estimate. But that model, and so it's based on a computer model, makes some predictions about what had to happen in the first seconds of the universe's birth. And one of the things that they make a prediction about is there should be a type of radiation across the night sky that we wouldn't be able to see until the universe, so we look back in time, that would appear to us about 380,000 years after the universe formed, so still a very long time ago. And that should have a particular feature. It should kind of look pretty similar in all directions, not identical, but very similar. And that's known as the cosmic microwave background. And when scientists looked for it, they found it, and it was there as had been predicted. And also by looking at the ages of particular stars go through a sequence. We came up with an estimate of 13.77 billion years ago that the universe formed. And there's relatively small confidence intervals around that of a few 100 million years or so. Now, of course, as with all science and everything I say in this talk, just one new observation of something older than that throws a spanner in the works. And recently there have been some suggestions that some photos that have been taken from the James Webb telescope suggest objects that are more than 13.8 billion years old. There's big arguments going on about that at the moment in the astrophysics world, and some people don't believe those ages of greater than 13.8, but others do. But at the moment, that's our best estimate. And so when the universe formed, it did so as a pinprick, tinier than the tiniest fundamental particle that we know today. So tinier than an electron, or tinier than a quark. There was an intensely hot bit of energy, billions of billions, perhaps infinitely hot and infinitely tiny. And that started to expand. And within the first microseconds of the universe, the four fundamental forces that are the heroes of the story of our universe emerged. And those are gravity, which you're all familiar with, the force that holds us to the planet. If you jump up, that's where you come down. Electromagnetism, so you'll all be familiar with magnetism. Most of you will be familiar with electromagnetism. And that's a force that if you run into a wall, why you don't go through the wall and bounce back. That's one manifestation of the force. But it also helps hold electrons around the nuclei of atoms. And then there's two other forces. There's the weak and the strong nuclear force. And the weak and the strong nuclear force operate to hold together quarks to form protons and neutrons, and to hold together protons and neutrons. But not all of those are stable. Some of them decay, like uranium. The weak nuclear force plays a role there. And without any of those forces, the universe would not look like it does today. Without the weak nuclear force, for example, stars could not shine. So these forces came out when the universe was extraordinarily young, a fraction of a second. And at the same time as these came about, we got the electrons and we got the quarks. But the universe was incredibly hot and it was starting to expand. It went through a very quick period of expansion known as inflation, when it went from the size, probably about a single atom, to the size of an orange or a basketball, depending on which physicist you talk to. huge period of inflation when the universe expanded incredibly quickly, but for a very short length of time. And it continued to expand. And as it did expand, it cooled. And as it cooled, the first thing that happened were the quarks came together to form protons and neutrons. And each proton and neutron has 3 quarks, 2 up quarks and a down quark, or 2 down quarks as an up quark for the protons and the neutrons. And so it was the strong nuclear force that joined the quarks together to form protons and neutrons. Then the next thing that happened is the universe cooled, and when the universe got to 380,000 years old, the electrons started to combine with the atomic nuclei, which were primarily just one proton and neutron together, to form mainly hydrogen, so the first atoms. And at that point, the universe became transparent and light could travel through it. And so we've got most of the first atoms to form were hydrogen, with a little bit of helium, the second heaviest element, and a little bit of lithium. And slowly then, over the next millions of years, tens of millions of years, these elements of hydrogen and helium started to collapse under the force of gravity. And as they collapsed under the strength of gravity, they formed the first galaxies and the first stars. And those stars, the first stars, were much larger than our sun. They were much bigger, but because they were bigger, they burned through their fuel very quickly. Large stars burn through their fuel quickly. And what they do is they're turning most of the hydrogen, first of all, into helium in a helium core, so the center of a star. And then as the star comes towards the end of its life, it goes through periods of expansion and contraction. This will happen to our star, our sun, in about possibly 4 or 5 billion years' time. We don't know exactly. It's probably a little bit about halfway through its life. But when the stars die, they go through this period of contraction. It breaks apart the helium nuclei, and there's still lots of hydrogen left that hasn't gone. And it pushes them together, it collapses down, and it makes the heavier elements. So as the first stars died, we started to see the first carbon, the first oxygen, the first nitrogen, etc., all the way up to iron. And when the really big stars collapse and they go supernova, you can get some of the heavier elements as well, up to things like uranium. So now we've got more complicated materials than the first atoms that were hydrogen and helium, and they were born in the death of the first stars. But then the second, third, and fourth generations of stars started to form. And as they formed, again, the stars, they formed from these huge disks of dust. And these disks of dust contain a lot of hydrogen still, but they contain molecules made from the heavier elements that are out there, all the elements that are out there. So things like water formed, things like carbon dioxide formed. But in these stellar clouds, what we're learning now is more complicated organic molecules formed, including some of the building blocks of life. And so in these clouds of dust where stars formed, you start to get molecules that life will eventually be able to use. And some of these are things like amino acids. Some of them are phosphates. So phosphate we'll see is in deoxyribonucleic acid, has a phosphate phosphorus-based backbone, and including some of the building blocks of lipids as well. These are formed in space, so they're formed off planet. But as the second and third and possibly fourth generation of stars forms, you start to get planets forming. And close to the star that's forming, the planets that form tend to be made, they're rocky planets, they tend to be made out of rock. And further out, you tend to get ice giants. So in our system, things like Saturn and Jupiter. And so we don't know, our solar system, we don't know what generation it is. We know it's not generation 1, 2, or 3, probably. And our solar system formed about 4.6 billion years ago, give or take. And it was very different from the way that it is now. And rocky planets formed further closer to the sun, and the gas giants further away. But a couple of really interesting things happened in those early days of our solar system. And so I'm going to concentrate, I'm just going to focus on two of those things. So one really odd thing about our solar system is that Mars is smaller than Earth. It should be bigger because there should have been more material for the planet to form from when it formed, and that should have made it larger than Earth. So as you come out from the sun, you've got Mercury, the smallest rocky planet, then Venus, then Earth, and then Mars. They're getting progressively bigger, and they get bigger as you continue out to Jupiter. However, Mars is small. And we also have a belt of debris, so meteorites and what have you, space rocks, which is a bit unusual. And so the best models to describe this is that when our solar system was young, Jupiter, shortly after it formed, began a journey from the outer solar system towards the sun. With each orbit, it was getting closer and closer, and it got to about where Mars is now. And it then got caught in a complicated gravitational dance between Saturn, which is another gas giant that formed far out, and the sun. And that stopped its journey towards the center of the solar system, so to the star, to the sun. And we should be thankful for that, because if it continued its journey, it would have probably taken out the young Earth. Anyway, it got pulled back in, and that's the best model we have. It's called the Grand Tack hypothesis, Jupiter Grand Tack hypothesis, that it started this journey in and it got pulled back as Saturn formed, and it got in this complicated gravitational dance. And that's why Mars is so small. The second thing that's happened that was kind of crucial for our planet was the formation of the moon. And so when about 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was very young. It had only just formed, and it was in a collision with a planet that's been named Theia. And that planet remelted the slowly cooling crust of Earth. It melted again. It turned it into a molten crust, a molten planet with seas of boiling rock. And it threw a huge amount of material into space. Some of that material accreted to form the moon. And when the moon formed, it was much closer to Earth than it is now. And the moon actually is still getting further away. So with each orbit of the Earth the moon makes, it gets a little bit further away. Don't worry too much. You're not going to notice it. But when the Earth formed and when the first oceans formed, tides would have been much, much stronger than they are now. And that might prove to be important in a little bit. But the collision would have basically broken apart any organic material that had formed on planet. And then the Earth had to cool. And so it cooled steadily. And then the first oceans formed, still very warm. And probably by about 4 billion years ago, the first life emerged on Earth. And the arguments, we don't know, this is one of the great unanswered questions of science, is exactly how life got started. Life is just complicated chemistry. And what had to happen, although we don't know the environment or the exact circumstances led to life get going, we know what had to happen. So there are kind of 3 things that life needs to do. It needs to be able to make copies of itself, so it needs to replicate. It needs an energy source in order to do that. So life takes an energy to make copies of itself. It's an endothermic reaction. And we obviously take in energy from food. You'll all be coming to have some food and a drink later, I hope. Obviously, plants get their energy from sunlight, and the first life would almost certainly have got it from highly reactive atoms and molecules. And those highly reactive molecules were almost certainly made in volcanoes. The third thing that life needs is a membrane to put around the replicating bit. And nowadays, your cells, the chemistry that's going on in your cells is way, way, way more complicated than the chemistry that's happening in the environment around you. So the chemistry that's happening on this or on this desk is very different and much simpler than the chemistry that's going on in your cells. But that couldn't have been the case when life got going. life emerged from a mix of chemicals, and those chemicals must have been very similar to the ones that eventually got enclosed in a membrane and started copying one another. So the question is, where did those chemicals, where did those molecules that life uses come from? And how did they end up self-assembling into something that replicates? Now, all of the key building blocks of life and water arrived on Earth. Some will have been made on planets, but on planet, but many of them arrived on Earth through space rocks, through meteors and space dust, of which there was much more than there is now. It's all been accreted into planets. And so, when the Earth was early, or most of the water in the oceans, many of the building blocks of life were delivered, having been made elsewhere within the disk that our galaxy formed, that our solar system formed from. And when they arrived, they then needed to concentrate in a way that life could get going, that autocatalytic, or that replication could begin. And so there's two hypotheses at the moment for where that happened, where this accumulation occurred. One is in thermal vents, ocean thermal vents called grey smokers. And there's a lot of energy coming, a lot of volcanic material coming through there, including highly reactive molecules. And it's possible that in tiny little cell-like structures that form around these oceanic vents, that you ended up with concentrations of the key building blocks of life, so that life is able to use. The other argument is that you ended up with concentrations occurring on land, on the first land, and in freshwater. So places like Yellowstone now, where you've got a geothermal plain where volcanic activity is coming to the surface. And so the argument largely around whether it formed in the ocean or it formed in fresh water. And there's compelling arguments for both, and we don't have the answer yet. One of the things that favors freshwater places where life started, environment where life started, is the gravity of the moon. The strong tidal power could have helped create complete repeated wetting and drying processes in sort of almost puddles, which allowed organic material to accumulate. But once it had accumulated wherever it happened, a type of reaction known as an autocatalytic reaction began. And an autocatalytic reaction is where a molecule of one type, so let's call it A, molecule of A can create another type of A, another molecule of A, as long as it's the right building blocks are there. Now, autocatalytic reactions are quite easy. They're not unusual. And once they get going, they're very powerful because one molecule of type A can make 2 molecules, can make 4, can make 8, and you end up with exponential growth. The first all life is autocatalytic. We're self-replicating. We do it with DNA. The first replicating molecules were probably not DNA. Some people have argued for RNA, although I think most people have argued against that being the first molecule, whilst others are arguing for proteins. And in fact, proteins like prions is the latest argument that people have made. But whatever the autocatalytic reaction was, it got going and it spread. The next thing we need is a membrane, and cell membranes are made out of phospholipids, and they're incredibly easy to form. So each of the key bits of life, energy coming from volcanic activity, membranes to surround it in, and autocatalytic reactions are all quite straightforward to get going. They're not complicated, but what we don't know is how they came together. They probably came together about 4 billion years ago, but once they did come together, we didn't have much of a waiting time until DNA became the universal code that life uses, the universal genetic code. So the last universal common ancestor, so the ancestor of all life on Earth today, is estimated through phylogenetic reconstructions across the tree of life to have lived about 3.9 billion years ago. So the waiting time from the first life form starting to DNA being discovered and evolved and being used is about 100 million years. Now, you might think that doesn't sound very long, but it's a blink of an eye in the age of the universe. So it looks like the building blocks of life can be made in space. They're delivered to planets by dust and by meteorites. We know this because we've collected meteorites with all sorts of organic compounds on them. They then manage to accumulate on Earth. And when they do each of the steps that's involved quite easy, but we're yet to find the environment where that happened. But I'd put, if I was a betting man, I'd put money that within the next couple of decades, we will make artificial life in the lab. And once it gets going, it creates DNA really quickly. And then it spread. But some of the waiting times now are really interesting. So you and me and plants and any animals are eukaryotes, and things like yeast as well. We're eukaryotes, and that means we've got quite complicated cells that are divided up but with all sorts of internal membranes that do all sorts of different functions. And eukaryote cells are much more complicated than bacteria. And the first bacteria would have been simpler than even the simplest bacteria alive today. But once life got going, it had about 1.5 billion years before we start to see the first eukaryotes. And so over that time period, I think life is building genetic networks within bacteria. Bacteria are diversifying, they're learning, they're evolving to live in new environments, to use new energy sources. So photosynthesis that uses oxygen arose probably about people argue, but say 3 to 3.5 billion years ago. Once that happened, oxygen was given off as a waste product. So cyanobacteria were the first bacteria to do this. They were the first global polluters. They built up, first of all, the oxygen got involved in all sorts of reactions with highly reactive molecule. Well, oxygen's highly reactive. It reacted with iron and everything on planet. And then it started to build up in the atmosphere. There's a lot we don't know about the buildup of oxygen in the atmosphere, but as it built up, it opened the way for more complex organisms to form from these eukaryotic animals. So the first animals probably formed about 800 million years ago based on genes. Plants were significantly earlier that. First animals about 800 million years ago. First probable animal fossils 575 million years ago during the Ediacaran. It was soft life. Life was very, there were no hard bits to these animal life then. It developed slowly. They were very simple ecosystems. The first animal ecosystems where animals were eating bacteria evolved about 300 meters, we think, in the ocean, so below the light zone. They were very simple ecosystems, and life couldn't make hard parts. But then about 540 or so million years ago, sea chemistry changed. And sea chemistry, when that sea chemistry changed, it meant that the dominant mineral that was made in the oceans, which had been called dolomite, and life can't use dolomite, stopped being formed, and calcium carbonate and silicates, which life can use, became readily available. And once they did, animals started to make hard parts. And once they made those hard parts, they started to eat one another. Predation kicked in. And the Cambrian explosion is driven as a predator-prey arms race. And then predator-prey arms race, host pathogen arms races, and plant herbivore arms races then led to an increase in complexity driven by evolution in our branch, the eukaryote and the tree of life. And it didn't really look back. And we continued, we were lucky that Earth continued to remain in the habitable zone. We have no idea how likely it is a planet remains suitable for life for 3.9 billion years. But there were many events during that time when life nearly died out. And those events, for example, include many great extinctions. So the biggest being the end Permian extinction, when 90% of life in the oceans was killed and 70%, perhaps a little bit more, died on land. That was caused by volcanic eruptions. But we've also had periods when the Earth was in very cold phases, ice ball Earth. Again, that pushed eukaryote life back to the brink, but it always recovered. And each time it recovered, it came back. And two groups of organisms called the synapsids and the sauropsids, we're descended from synapsids, dinosaurs were the sauropsids, have taken it in turns to be the dominant species on Earth at the moment, and mammals, which descended from the synapsids, are currently there. So life didn't look back. Many of you here are biologists, so I'm not going to lecture you too long about evolution. But one key step, and again, this is a really interesting area of research, which we're starting to make headway in, or neuroscientists and consciousness researchers are making headway in, is when did sentience emerge? So this is challenging because first of all, we need to be able to define what consciousness is. And actually, medics have a way of doing that. And they do that by looking at the brain waves that we produce. So when you're awake and you're listening and you're solving a problem or you're thinking, your brain waves have a particular pattern. And it's not completely random and it's not completely organized. So there's some pattern in it, there's some predictability, but we can't predict it perfectly. And brain waves will start in one part of the brain and they will spread out and then die out in other parts of the brain. And there's a particular kind of signature that we can measure. And that signature is actually used to determine whether people are alive or what have you. Now, when you're in a coma or when you're on most hallucinating drugs, your brain waves can become a bit fucked. And they lose that structure and they become much more random and you're not with it. So if you're in a coma or you're under anesthetic, your brain waves change and you have no recollection of time when you come out. You don't know how long you've been out for. Now, the reason this is interesting, because once you've got a definition of consciousness based on brain waves, you can start to look for it in other animals. And as people have started to do that, they have found signatures of brain waves in other animals that are very similar to the types of brainwave pattern we see in ourselves. So a study a couple of years ago did this in octopus, and they found brain waves in octopus, and they're very different from us. We last shared a common ancestor them back in the Cambrian. They have a distributed brains, their tentacles can do independent things. But the brain waves, some of their brain waves are surprisingly similar to the brain waves we see when we're solving problems and they're solving problems. Other bits of their brain waves are like nothing we've seen before at all. But this has led to many scientists and many neuroscientists suggesting that, and this makes sense to me, that consciousness or sentience is on a continuum. We're very definitely at one end, but actually things like this American raven or dolphins or crows or whales or octopus even actually have a fairly advanced degree of sentience. But even things like shrimp and the common housefly may have wisps of it. And that means they have an ability to experience the world and to act on that experience. And that may involve moving around. But in humans, obviously, this became really well developed. And the story about how it became really well developed is interesting. So we're primates. Primates evolved. The first primates were probably before the last great extinction, 66 million, or the first ancestors of primates. They looked like tree shrews. After the dinosaurs went extinct, they began to expand. They were able to expand. They started feeding on fruit. This fruit was on angiosperms, so plants that produce fruits and some nuts. Angiosperms evolved about 135 million years ago, but angiosperm forests only came into existence after the last great extinction, and that opened up an opportunity for primates to evolve. They then slowed their life history. All primates have a relatively slow life history compared to other animals. If you look at a vervet monkey and you compare it to, say, something like a muskrat, vervet monkey won't breed for the first time until it's 4 to 6 years old, will live for 15 or 16 years. Muskrat will breed at 1 year and will be dead by the time it's 6 or 7. All primates are like that. So that was the first thing that happened. We slowed our life history. The great apes evolved. And then the trees started to disappear in Africa, in part because of the rising of the Isthmus of Panama, which meant that sea currents changed, ocean currents changed. And as ocean currents changed, Africa became drier and trees very slowly disappeared. And that pushed our ancestors onto the ground. At that point, predation became a real issue for us. We started to get eaten. We were pretty safe in the trees. And the way that we dealt with that, the way that we evolved with that, is that's when we started to use tools and we started to live in larger groups, or we used our group sizes that we'd had in the trees. We lived in larger groups, and then our brains went through a few step size increases, and we switched from being predators to scavenging for meat as well as feeding on fruit and vegetation. And then eventually we became top predators ourselves when we went out killing things. We spread around the world. And the first, an ancestor of ours called Homo erectus left Africa, and it evolved into Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovan man in Asia. Certainly, Neanderthals were very smart. Their brain sizes weren't far off ours. They almost certainly had language. There's evidence they buried their dead in some places. They certainly did the oldest cave art before we did. But then humans evolved. We left Africa. We tried to leave Africa 125,000 years ago. We didn't get very far, probably because we couldn't compete with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. But then about 60 to 70,000 years ago, we left Africa and we made our way around to Australia, arriving there about 60,000 years ago, give or take. There's some debate about exactly when, but it took us another 20,000 years to really get into Europe. We got into Europe through climate change that favored humans over the Neanderthals that lived there. There was some mating with Neanderthals, some introgression. That's why we have some Neanderthal genes. And they died out. Then we moved our way around the world, made it to North America about 16,500 years ago, South America a little bit later, and then eventually out to the islands of the Pacific and New Zealand about 1,000 years ago, approximately. Everywhere we went, when we arrived, we caused extinction. So before we left Africa, and in a way that Neanderthals didn't. Before we left Africa, there were 57 species of terrestrial mammal that weighed over a ton. By the time we'd got to New Zealand, we were down to 11. We are not good at, I mean, you know, you're a biological audience. We are not good, and we have never been good at living with large animals, including predators, and we're continuing on that journey. But as we went on that journey, and in each place we went, as we reduced the amount of food that we could live on and kill through hunting, we started to take up agriculture. And this was a slowish process. People have probably been able to know about agriculture for some time, but it didn't really take off until 12 or so thousand years ago. It then evolved independently in various places. Agriculture is a hard life. It's not easy. You've got to tend the crops, but it meant we stayed in one place. We became less nomadic. We started to see an increase in bone diseases when you look through the fossil record through malnutrition starting once agriculture took off. But once agriculture took off, that was the beginning of civilization. And about 10,000 years ago, around then was when the first town came into existence. That was called Coulson. All of the buildings are the same, which suggests it was a very egalitarian culture, but it didn't take long before hierarchies evolved elsewhere in towns like Ur in Mesopotamia. And from then on, the rest is history. Okay. The last bit, I'm not going to talk about this now because I'm running out of time, is what makes our personality. And it's a mix of genes, environment, and chance. I don't have time to go through that now. But having done this kind of overview that I've done very quickly, coming back to the question about were we inevitable at the birth of the universe? And if we ran it again, would we be here? Or have we won the cosmic lottery? I'd give you an answer to that in the last chapter of the book, and you're obviously going to have to buy the book to get the answer. But it's actually it's a difficult one, because the reason that some physicists believe in superdeterminism is down to the behavior of tiny particles. You all know that you'll know what quantum theory is, quantum mechanics, but there's part of that which is called quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement means you can take particles, you can join them together and they have the same wavelengths. So each particle is a tiny particle is a particle in a wave. And you combine them and you entangle them so they have the same wavelengths. And then you take them apart, you put one over here and one over here. You do something to that particle and that particle changes in response because they're entangled with their wave functions. And that's a real problem, or we don't understand it fully. And it's a real problem because it suggests that all particles in the universe are entangled. And if you change one, all of the others change. And if that's true, that suggests that the universe is deterministic. Now, an argument that I kind of put in the book that other people have made is that we just haven't really worked out the correct interpretation of quantum entanglement yet. And there's still a lot of argument about what the interpretation of quantum mechanics is. But one of the things I think we can say is, how much of this can science tell us? So, for example, for the universe to start, we had to have something instead of nothing. We had to have that singularity, that piece of energy. We don't know why there is something rather than nothing. We don't know why that singularity of energy appeared. Some mathematicians have written down theories that say what was before, the nothingness that was before, was unstable, and it collapsed to form the universe. We then know that the four fundamental forces emerged: gravity, electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear force. If those forces had slightly different strengths, even just a couple of percent, we wouldn't have been able to form atoms. We wouldn't have been able to form stars. Life couldn't have existed. So the four forces needed to have the right strengths for the universe to look like it is today. And again, we don't know whether, if we form lots of universes, whether we'll always get four forces. Sometimes we might get 5 or 6 or 2 or 3, and whether they'd have the same strengths or not. We just don't have the answers to that. Some people say that the fact that the four forces are that they are the way they are, and that allows us to be here, means that, you know, there must be some sort of divine creation. I don't buy that, because we couldn't be in a universe making those observations unless the four forces were the strengths that they are. So I think it's a circular argument. Earth needed to form and to develop an atmosphere. That the atmosphere developed when the moon hit. I don't think that's unlikely. There are trillions and trillions of planets in just the observable universe, let alone the universe we can't observe. And so I think the fact that Earth-like planets form fairly frequently, the exoplanets we've looked at so far, we've looked at about 6,000. We've already found some that are about the size of Earth, about the same distance away, but we haven't found any with evidence of life yet. Earth needed to remain in the habitable zone for 4 billion years. We have less evidence on that. Life needed to get going. I think it's just chemistry. I think it probably forms reasonably frequently. How often it becomes complex is an open question. And then we had to emerge. But if I was a gambling man, I think that life is probably fairly common. Simple life probably gets started reasonably quickly. And the reason for that, there's nothing to expect. The conditions that were on Earth when life started were particularly unusual. And there's so many planets, the universe is so vast, I suspect it gets going reasonably frequently. And then once it's got going, I think if you give it long enough, it probably will end up getting more complicated. And so there's an opportunity for intelligent life to occur elsewhere. We haven't found it yet, but that's not surprising, because we've only explored a tiny corner of our universe, and we've only been looking for a very short period of time. And it's unclear how long civilizations last. All civilizations on Earth before ours ended. You know, they're doing well if they make it to a couple of thousand years. So we shouldn't expect to be around forever. I hope our universe lasts for, our civilization lasts for some time, certainly long enough for you to buy the book. And I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for that to it. We'll open up to questions. I'll kick off with one, and I've always been struck by how quickly life appears in its basic life as soon as conditions on Earth exist for it. And one of your ideas is, well, basic life is simple to make because it's just chemistry, but it's also complexity and anti-entropy and things that are not so trivial. So the alternative is that simple life forms elsewhere, in stardust or somewhere drifting between the solar system. But if you have any thoughts on whether early life came from elsewhere.
So I mean, you're right, the entropy argument. So the entropy argument is things, you know, that start in a reasonably organized state, kind of break down into disarray and less order over time. That's essentially what entropy is. And people have argued for a long time and struggled, because clearly on Earth, we've gone against entropy. We started simple, we've ended up with highly organized life forms. The way out of that is entropy is something we should be measuring on the whole universe. And across the entire universe, entropy almost certainly, I mean, it's still expanding. So entropy is increasing within the universe, but that doesn't preclude in some pockets for things like us to occur. So I think that's reasonably easy. In terms of the argument of panspermia, it's an interesting one. So that's life could have formed elsewhere and then made its way to Earth. Although we've found lots of organic materials on things like the Murchison meteorite, which is a meteorite that crashed into Murchison near Victoria in Australia, it's aged at 7.5 billion years, so it's older than the solar system. It has thousands of organic molecules on it. They hadn't assembled themselves into life. So I think the building blocks of life are definitely made elsewhere. it's possible that life was made elsewhere and came to Earth. However, you've then got to say, how did it get here? How did it manage to kind of get off wherever it formed onto a meteorite or a space rock and then make its way over here? So the panspermia argument, although it gives you more opportunities and more environments for life to form, you've got the extra complexity of how do you get it from there over to Earth. And so I think the reason that panspermia isn't a widely researched area of science at the moment is for that second problem, because you've now got two difficult problems to solve rather than one.
It's okay. We can open up. Okay, Sarah.
I did chemistry at Cambridge ages and ages ago and know a bit about thermodynamics, but not much. And my picture of it is that it works, these predictions work in a closed system. But Earth as a planet isn't a closed system, is it?
No.
So doesn't that totally explode the entropy argument?
No, I don't think it does. I think as I said, I think entropy has to work on the entire universe. That's the argument that people have come up with now. And I mean, it's one of the points I tried to make earlier on. In order for life to get going, you needed to have this concentration of the molecules to do that. Although those systems wouldn't have been completely closed, and they were able to build up the concentrations, the arguments that the chemists make these days who are working on the emergence of life is that they should be sufficiently stable and therefore long enough that you can get the autocatalytic reactions kicking off. One thing I didn't talk about is the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle is central to all life. And the Krebs cycle is interesting because it can run in two directions. When you don't have oxygen, it runs in the opposite direction to the way that it runs when you have oxygen. It's actually quite easy to get the Krebs cycle, or certainly elements of the Krebs cycle, going in. So many of the building blocks of the Krebs cycle, for example, have arrived on meteorites and have been found on space dust. So once you get the Krebs cycle going, that's not an autocatalytic reaction, but once you can couple it to that, then the arguments these days are, that's how life got going. And once it got going, it didn't look back. What I think is remarkable is it didn't take life long to get going. And I think that's something that kind of plays to the panspermia argument that you're making. But I think that kind of where chemistry is at the moment, I'm not an expert on it, I read very widely around it, that actually the entropy argument doesn't blow it out of the water and we can get it going. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. So concerning consciousness, right? You said it's on a spectrum. Yeah. What does the spectrum include? Like who you think it's included or what, or yeah.
So I think you need to have a brain an organism has to have some form of brain for brain waves to exist. So for us to be able to measure it. So does that mean that they're sentient? If you can measure it, probably not. Not all animals are. So I mean, it's quite interesting. So there are some organisms where the juvenile stage has a brain and then they settle and then the brain is dissolved. So, some larvae of some marine organisms have a brain. The brain then gets dissolved. Some people have argued that's a bit like academia. Like when you're a faculty professor, you don't need your brain anymore. But I don't think that those organisms really have consciousness. I think that things like fruit flies, where people have measured brain waves, they have wisps of, tiny, they're able to have some form of experience, right? So consciousness is definitely, most people would argue that consciousness is linked to the ability to experience the world around you. So you need sense organs and you need to be able to process the information that's coming in and act on it. We know that for things like houseflies, when they have a scare or are hurt in some way temporarily, they change their behavior. So there's clearly some very simple rules that are going on within their tiny brains that allow them to do that. Now, I don't think that's strictly consciousness in a way that we should worry about it, but I think it's kind of the wisps of it. In terms of animals that are actually thinking they're alive and aware of it, then, it's us and probably the Neanderthals, right? Is probably about as far as we could go there. Some people might argue, well, maybe elephants, I don't know. But, or some of the great apes. But I think it's certainly true that a lot of animals, a lot more than we thought, do appear to experience the environment and to experience pain, right? And pain is probably the source of consciousness. That's kind of one of the most basic forms of experience that animals have. So it's a continuum, but there's probably somewhere on that continuum where you start to know that you're conscious. And I suspect it's only humans and Neanderthals that got to that point. Does that answer your question?
But yeah, but aren't brain waves that correlate to
Yeah, they are,
consciousness?
absolutely.
So
absolutely. But you have to be able to measure it to know it's there. And that's the tool that people use to measure it at the moment. We're not saying the brainwave pattern. Well, actually, some neuroscientists, there's a couple of neuroscientists who have argued that brainwave patterns are consciousness. I don't buy that. It's a signature of consciousness. But it's a useful tool because we know in us, by looking at the patterns of when we're awake and we're conscious and we're thinking versus when we're off our heads on LSD or drunk or in a coma or in an anesthetic. It's interesting to look at the range of brain waves in us in different states and then use that to sort of say, okay, we now have a way that we can measure this. And I think that's a reasonable starting point. It's, we're going to learn a lot more about consciousness in the next 2 or 3 decades. I have absolutely no doubt. We're learning how the brain works. We've got 6 layers of cortical columns. We know how networks, we know how the brain works in terms of building up simulations of the world around us. Your brain is sat in a dark box. It's getting signals from your eyes and from your senses, and it's building up a simulation in your brain. It's amazing how far we've come in terms of building up that simulation. So we know how the brain works. We know how to measure consciousness, but we can't link those 2 things together. Now, some people, that kind of links to something called the hard problem of consciousness. And that's basically, why aren't the zombies doing exactly what we're doing, but not knowing about it? I don't see why that's a sensible starting point, that could exist. We're complicated. We're doing all sorts of things. I think it's inevitable that we must have some. I don't see why we think we should be able to do that as a zombie. I think that's the wrong starting point. So I don't think the hard problem of consciousness exists. But a philosopher will tell me I'm just using philosophical arguments to get around it.
thank you.
Right, thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. Most of life on Earth is ultimately powered by sunlight, right? That plants photosynthesize and herbivores eat plants and carnivores eat herbivores. But there are also chemosynthetic bacteria in deep sea vents. And I was wondering, do you think that given enough time and stable conditions that these chemosynthetic organisms could have developed into complex organisms with sentience, or are there physical limitations that would prevent that from ever
So you
happening?
mean if there was no sunlight at all?
Yeah.
Could you
You know,
power?
are there other planets with sentient civilizations that are chemosynthetic
It's
based?
possible. I suspect it would take a lot longer, simply for the reason there's going to be much less environment for life to disperse to. So you're ending up with quite small population sizes. And so I think evolution, life tries to explore new opportunities and new energy sources. So we can't rule out that possibility that complex life could develop on a planet without a sun, that's just out there. But I think it would take a lot longer, and that probably precludes it getting too complicated. I think that the diversification is key. One of the main drivers, so evolution really took off once predation started. You look at what happened in the Ediacaran when predation hadn't evolved, and evolution was slow. It really kicked off. The Cambrian explosion is an astonishing period of diversity. And that, most people, I think, believe that was driven by the evolution of hard parts that allowed predation. So, and then that kind of drove the evolution of the senses. So sense organs like the eyes, they appear in the Cambrian, the ability to feel and what have you. So I think you probably, on Earth, if we didn't have the sun, would that have happened around deep sea vents? I don't know, or marine thermal vents. I don't know. It's an interesting idea and an interesting thought experiment. But
I wonder, but to me, life is also metabolism.
Yeah, it is.
But the chemosynthesis could never really provide enough energy flow for.
It probably couldn't. Sorry, that's my point I was going to make. It probably can't to get long food chains, would be my suspicion, and that you'd need long food chains in order to really get the driver of complexity, which has been predation and other arms races. So it's probably unlikely, but not impossible.
Thank you. Just to return, you were mentioning in this primordial soup, then rather having DNA appearing first, it might have been proteins or prions. And I know very little about, maybe some of the other biologists in the room know far more about prions than I do, but this sort of mysterious way that they can induce changes in folding, et cetera, induce changes of shape. That strikes me as either a wonderful thing for diversification of protein shapes or a very dangerous thing to have around when you're trying to create life. Can you talk more about that, or why
Yeah,
the
so
prions are a theory?
there's a book that's just, it's just been published, and it's all about prions. And I was reading it the other day, and the guy makes a compelling argument that because prions are autocatalytic and they're stable, right? But you still need the building blocks in order for them to be autocatalytic. So prion diseases, a misfolded protein is able to take other proteins and related proteins and misfold them to make it like itself. It doesn't happen very quickly, but they're able to do that. But they're very, very stable, and they can survive in the environment for a long time. So his argument is they have properties. Some of those proteins are relatively simple. I mean, they're still like long strings of amino acids, but they have some of the properties that life would need to get going, and the fact that they're stable and they're autocatalytic. It's a nice idea, but it's more. So the problem with the RNA first argument is RNA can catalyze reactions, so it can drive things, but it's subject to high rates of mutation. And the mutation rate is thought to be too high for it to really be a contender at the moment as the first replicating molecule. We don't know what it is. I think the prion idea is a nice idea because they're so stable, but and there's enough information in them. But exactly how it happened, we don't know yet. But it's possible. It's a very new suggestion, but I thought it was interesting and certainly compelling.
I was wondering what you thought might happen next.
So next, I don't know, but in about 1 billion years' time, life on Earth is going to end when we run out of all things carbon dioxide. So the history of the planet goes from an atmosphere, and it's fluctuated obviously, but an atmosphere that was very rich in carbon dioxide, and it's now down, to low levels. We're worried about it going up. And we should be worried about going up. I'm not being flippant about it in any way at all through our activities. But eventually we will run out. It will all be locked up. It will have all been used up by plants. Photosynthesis stops, and then the food chains break down. We might end up, if there's still any volcanic activity going on, then there might be life hanging on around deep sea vents. It might be almost kind of completely symmetrical. You never know. So that's what will happen in the long time. Then let's say life finds a new way of hanging on, then the sun is going to die in about 4 or 5 billion years' time. That's going to destroy all life on Earth unless we've got off Earth. What will happen next? Our civilization will come to an end at some point. I hope it's not too soon. I'm not convinced that we're doing a lot of good to keep it going. We seem to be on a course where we have the ability to wipe ourselves out. We don't have the ability to wipe life out, but so although I'm an optimist and I hope we will find solutions, and I don't think our civilization is going to collapse in the next few years, but we never know with a Trump elected in, but let's hope not. But yeah, in terms of the science, I think we will get a better understanding of consciousness. I think we will get a better understanding of how life got going and what life is. I think we get to a point when we'll be able to make artificial life in the laboratory. I think we'll always struggle to know why there is something rather than nothing. I don't think we're going to be able to do the experiments where we create multiple universes and see what happens. We will continue to make advancements in biology, but we're never going to I don't believe we'll ever get to the point in biology because it is so complex that we will have anything approaching the equations that physics have. Like, quantum mechanics is an unbelievably successful theory. We're not going to get close to that. Evolution's fantastic as a theory, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have the predictive ability that bits of chemistry and physics do. But we will still continue to make progress. And I think we should accept the fact that we're not going to be able to predict living systems particularly accurately, and admit that, and be honest about, we can understand what's going on, but they're so complex and they're subject to so many feedbacks, both positive and negative, that we're probably we're foolish when we say we know exactly what's going to happen when we make such and such a conservation or management intervention. So that's what I think will happen next.
Can't work out whether it's a gloomy or a happy note to end on. So, so anybody got any final questions? In which case, I think we'll end on the happy note. The thing that's going to happen next is the drinks reception and the and the book signing. So do come and join us around the corner for that. And thank you, Tim, for starting off in such a spectacular, ultimate big picture style.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Great.
Is that right?
That's good. Brilliant. Yeah.
I mean, it makes people think.
Yes,
doesn't it?
yeah.
I think that's